start by thanking Dr. Schwam, the Leffert family for supporting this wonderful event for the MGH community. And I also want to thank Vicki for inviting me to deliver tonight's 10th annual Leffert lecture. I'm really honored to be with you this evening. I'm grateful not only to Vicki, but also to Lucas and Eddie and Hassan and his team at the On Being Conversations Project, to our other chat chaplains, and also to Ajoma and Doreen for offering some reflections. It is nerve-wracking to think about the risk it is for Vicki to invite someone who is not a medical professional and who is not going to be talking about medicine or medical research to deliver this talk tonight. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I am persuaded that conflict resilience is really directly related to health at both an individual level, but also at an organizational level for MGH. And as Vicki and others have said by way of introduction, right, this is a moment of national polarization. It's also a moment, though, I know, when MGH is accelerating its own institutional commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, both in the workplace and also in patient care. As some of you may know, for more than 2 decades, my own professional work has really focused on teaching professionals, from students to lawyers, diplomats, and to medical professionals, how to negotiate and how to resolve conflict. And that is a really important and rewarding line of work for me. But tonight, I'm actually not going to speak about resolving conflicts, and I'm not going to speak about negotiation to create value, and I'm not going to be speaking about problem solving. Tonight, I'm going to speak to you about something that to me feels really urgent in this moment. And it's really about a sensibility and a capacity that I call conflict resilience. And it's something that I believe is really unattended to in education and in leadership today. And that if given its due, could really turn the tide on bitterness, polarization, and stalemate that we find ourselves in this moment. So I want to make the case tonight that if our society is to survive and to thrive, we have to focus our attention on cultivating conflict resilience in ourselves and also in those in whom we task with leadership, whether at MGH or in the other institutions of consequence in our society. As you see some of these photos, my guess is that few of you would be keen to spark a conversation that might engage those depicted on the topic about which they seem to be protesting. And when I say conversation, let me be clear about what I do and do not mean. I do not mean an interaction that looks like a debate or a fight or a negotiation in which you're trying to persuade them that you are right and they are wrong. Rather, I'm speaking of a conversation that is marked by genuine and generous listening, and also authentic and articulate expression of your own views and perspectives on the issue. And my guess is, as you look at these pictures, you might be more inclined to these activities, like donating to a particular political cause, or maybe getting out and canvassing, or maybe ensuring that you and every single person you know votes, or maybe acting to mobilize, or maybe taking to the streets and resisting. And I don't want to downplay the importance of any of these activities. After the events of the past year, from the COVID-19 pandemic that really laid bare the deep inequities in our society that have cost so many lives, to the killing of George Floyd, to the climate crisis, to the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, it's clear that activism in the form of protest and mobilization and organizing and rallying really matters. But I want to make the case today that there is an equally important mode of civic engagement, and one that is in short supply these days, but greatly needed at this moment. And that is dialogue. That is genuine encounter with the perceived other or the opposition. And I think there are many reasons why dialogue as a form of civic engagement is on the decline. And they range from arguments that the time for talking has expired, or the urgency of the crisis is facing us are too dire, or the sense that dialogue at this point is pointless or weak, or just another opportunity for historically marginalized persons to be tasked with educating the privileged among us. In this talk, I want to focus primarily on our individual and collective failure to develop conflict resilience as a key reason why encounter and engagement with the other has become less frequent in this moment when we actually need more of it. So first, what do I mean by conflict resilience? It is the ability to sit with and be fully present around those with whom we have fundamentally different views on critical issues that cut to our core, to listen to those others with a full and generous heart, to express our own viewpoint with authenticity and with grace, and in a way that maximizes the likelihood that the individuals on the other side can hear us. So conflict resilience envisions doing all of this without the purpose or likelihood of persuading the other side, or even of finding common ground. And it matters because bad news here, no matter how effective you are at advocating or campaigning or negotiating, you and I will be unable to wholly persuade or otherwise vanquish the sizable set of people who hold the opposite viewpoints that you and I might. And the notion that we can simply coexist without ever dealing with or bumping into these people defies life in a modern democratic society. I would say that any fading notion that we could somehow just separate ourselves from our Fox News loving brother-in-law in Indiana or our super woke Gen Z cousin in Bushwick and simply lead peaceful lives undisturbed has really been laid bare by the events of the past year. Our fates are deeply interwoven. Retreating to cocoons of comfort, even if desirable, is simply not possible. So with conflict all around us, what do we do? At the risk of oversimplifying, I want to say there are some traditional approaches to conflict handling. I think we're familiar with some of them. The first is fighting, right? Which can look like this, maybe when we're kids, or like this, maybe when we're adults, or for people in my profession, which is law, it can look like this. Sadly, for our nation's history, it had to look like this once. And unfortunately, more recently in our country, it looked like this on January 6th. A second common mode, of course, we have is flight, right? Fleeing. And avoidance has always been a very popular method of conflict handling. But I would say in the past 15 to 20 years, we've developed some new and I would say particularly unhealthy forms of avoidance. With all its benefits in terms of creating and curating communities of interest, social media has also led us to create personally curated tribes with shared interests, viewpoints, and affiliation. And in an earlier age, when community was more geographically based, we couldn't just escape when we had a different view from our neighbors on a local or national political issue. But with so much of our sense of community coming from Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or Snapchat, we so easily block, ignore, or shut out those with whom we disagree. And we build these communities of convenience. And of course, the rise in partisan cable news networks is another form of active avoidance. These allow us to silo ourselves, to flee from the difference of opinion, and to sit in the comfort of our own partisan perceptions. The result is a lower conflict resilience threshold. And of course, there's a third approach to conflict handling. That's fixing, that's problem solving, using consensus building or negotiation or restorative justice or facilitation, right? All the skills that I teach and that I believe in strongly to help parties reconcile, resolve, and move forward. And I want to make one thing clear as part of this talk. I am completely in favor of problem solving, but I really want to separate out conflict resilience from problem solving, from fixing. Because my argument is that we need conflict resilience, this capacity to engage across difference and to sit with discomfort that is completely detached from any hope of problem solving or fixing. Why? Well, because solving requires so much more than simply arriving at a correct technocratic answer or scientific solution. It also means securing a sufficient cooperation on the part of people of goodwill to enact said solution. And that can only come when there is enough trust within a relational system whether that be within a personal relationship or within an institution like MGH or within a national government, that one will accede willfully to the collective consensus, even if that consensus does not accord with one's preferred viewpoint. In this moment of vaccine hesitancy, with upwards of 35% of Republican men resisting a vaccine, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, we can see the consequence of the silos. We can see the consequence of low trust and mutual villainization. Claiming emergency on all sides and then using narrow majorities or coercive measures to impose our preferred outcomes without the deep listening and without the genuine engagement of the other may ultimately do more harm than good. The wins will be short-term, compliance will be low, and we will be subject to the same treatment when the tables turn. The forcing approach loses the opportunity to do the kind of relational work and trust building that comes from a more conflict resilient stance, one that is less bent on immediate problem solving and more focused on learning and trusting through discomfort. In January, as I was walking my dog, Rosie, I was listening to the podcast called In the Bubble. Some of you may know this podcast. And I heard your former colleague and our new CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, talk about a lesson that she learned as a young doctor. And I want to share that brief clip with you now.
First of all, thank you. One of the things, I spent a lot of time with social workers in my HIV background, and one of the things they said is when you give a new HIV diagnosis to somebody, the next thing you do is wait and you don't speak again until they speak. And that gives you a sense of what it is that's hurting them the most. What are they worried about? Are they worried about their job? Are they worried about their safety? Are they worried about their children? Are they, what is it that there's, and that's usually the next thing that comes out. So I don't think we've given that voice to people who don't want to wear a mask. What is it or who don't want a vaccine? What is it that's worrying you the most?
So in this moment, when I see all sides of the political divide whipping themselves into a frenzy with the dire predictions that our nation is on the brink of ruin, I think conflict resilience implores us to take the time to ask the question of the other. What is it that is worrying you the most? What is it that is worrying you the most? But, listen, I get it. I get why urgency and dread counsel action over listening. A recent CBS News poll found that most Americans actually see other Americans as the biggest threat to our way of life. This is a pretty stunning poll result. More than COVID, more than foreign forces. And I totally get that if you perceive someone to be a threat, protecting yourself and your family seems way better than pulling up a chair. Pulling up a chair is risky, it's really hard, but it's precisely here that I want to resist the call to arms, because it's precisely here in this moment where conflict resilience matters, that developing that ability to sit in the presence of those who make us very uncomfortable, very unsettled, and sometimes even hurt, right? Still here to listen, to cultivate curiosity. And that is because I think at some level, right, that cultivation of curiosity and that listening is a really prerequisite to problem solving. Now, I want to be completely clear. This message, I am certain, lands especially hard on some of you listening right now, because many of the divisive issues that are causing polarization do not land equally on all persons, whether on racial justice, reproductive rights, healthcare for all, religious freedom, or queer rights, to name a few. Certain populations accrue disproportionate costs. And so, yes, the call to conflict resilience is a call with unequal costs. But I would say that is the same as the call to all sorts of advocacy and all sorts of social justice efforts. And it is why, especially now, we need people who can invest the time, energy, courage, and skill building for what it demands of us. So what does conflict resilience get us? I want to propose a number of things. One is growth and empathy, which of course is a skill set that is useful in every form of leadership, but I would say is particularly essential in the practice of medicine. And when we practice the skills of conflict resilience, we can no longer see the other as a unidimensional cartoon caricature, but rather as a three-dimensional person. It also helps to reduce demonization, dehumanization, and increase connection. Those of you who know the country music might know the band, the Brothers Osborne. So this week in Tennessee, the Tennessee State Legislature was about to honor T.J. Osborne, who recently came out as gay, until a single state representative, Representative Jeremy Faison, blocked the measure. After the vote, the Brothers Osborne tweeted this. They said, "We've lived in this state for over half of our lives. Jeremy Faison honored Ben Shapiro, who doesn't even live here. Jeremy, let's have lunch one day. On us. Would really like to know more about you as a person." A few hours later, he responded, "I would be honored to break bread with you." And then they responded, "We'll message you directly." To me, this is the kind of conflict resilience that takes a tremendous amount of courage. It helps us to learn more about each other as human persons. And it's independent of whether they reach an agreement. It's simply an opportunity to humanize. I also think that conflict resilience helps increase the social capital in our culture, in our society, increases the likelihood that we could coexist peacefully. It increases our own patience, our tolerance, other virtues similar to that. And it increases our own ability to problem solve on all sorts of domains where maybe we might actually agree. So of course, with all the benefits, right, how do we do this, right? So first of all, right, I want to say that, why is my computer has stopped advancing? Oh, here we go. Yeah, good. So first important is conflict resilience, right, really requires courage. Courage to stay with and courage to be uncomfortable, right? See that Osborne example above. It also requires a willingness to listen deeply and to be really curious, to set aside preconceived notions of the other. See the Dr. Walensky example. Third, it requires vulnerability and self-confidence, the ability to assert one's own experience and belief with others, knowing that the worth of our own story, that very authentic act of self-revelation is a gift to others, even if it is not acknowledged. So consider the work of Professor Loretta Ross at Smith College. She is a Black feminist civil rights activist who teaches a class there called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. Back in November, she was featured in a New York Times article for her approach to class conversation and engagement. Instead of the calling out culture, which she describes as a culture where someone is castigated for saying something that might not fit with prevailing norms or expectations, she talks about the importance of calling in. And she believes that the call out culture has taken conversations that could have been learning opportunities and turned them into mud wrestling on a social media platform where virtue signaling on behalf of social justice becomes a varsity sport. And when Ross talks about calling in, she doesn't mean something that is avoidant or sweet, or that somehow finds fake common ground where there might not be any. Instead, for her, it is an act of reaching out to someone in a way that preserves their dignity, gives them space, but also provides an opportunity for you to share your experience, your lived experience. A source perhaps of why a comment or a belief or an assumption may be very hurtful and in fact completely incomplete and inaccurate. In December, Professor Ross was a guest on NPR's On Point program. I want to share just a clip of her speaking about the value of engaging with others, even across something that might be particularly painful.
You know, your experience as a Black feminist civil rights advocate, you know, you're talking about the Klan a second ago. What does that have to do with the digital calling out culture now that we seem to be surrounded by?
Well, I think that if a Black woman can learn to have civil conversations with someone who's been in the Ku Klux Klan, we should be able to have civil conversations with everybody because we have to remember that there's humanity behind the words, that there's humanity behind the action. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about walking up to the boys in the hood and saying, I want to be your best friend or anything. But at the same time, we can't dehumanize people simply because we disagree with their political perspectives.
So I just love this example of courage in speaking your truth. I want to share another example with you. So this one involves Anthony Fauci, but from a long, long time ago. So some of you, I'm sure, are too young to remember this. But at the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in this country, which is in the mid-1980s, Fauci was one of the most vocal advocates on behalf of HIV/AIDS research within the very conservative Reagan administration. So imagine waking up on the morning of June 28th, 1988, to read an op-ed in the San Francisco Examiner written by ACT UP founder Larry Kramer saying this, quote, Anthony Fauci, you are a murderer. You should be put to a firing squad. Now, if you are Anthony Fauci, there are any number of moves you might make, from firing back to maybe securing your own protective detail. But what he does is amazing. Let's listen. I'm getting a spinning wheel on my computer, though. But we're going to still listen.
We have to go back 2 years to 1988, to that letter that Larry Kramer wrote to Fauci where he called him a murderer. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
The whole murderer thing?
Of course, of course.
When Dr. Fauci saw that letter, he thought,
if somebody is that angry to be able to print that in a national newspaper, I mean, I got to find out what is it that has stimulated him to do that.
So he just called this guy who called him a murderer, called him on the phone and said, let's figure this out.
So what happens, right, is Kramer puts Fauci in touch with ACT UP activists in DC, and they begin regular dinner parties with each other. This is for real, right? Ultimately, as Fauci tells the story, the parties caused him to change the way he thought about clinical trials for early AIDS treatment drugs, causing him to enroll more diverse pools into the trials to reflect the diversity of the affected population. And to me, this is conflict resilience in action. And for conflict resilience to flourish, right, it's important to also be intentional about how do we establish containers where we can actually create more low risk opportunities for exchanges to happen. So I've done a lot of work with an organization called Seeds of Peace. This is an organization that brings young people together across lines of difference and conflict to Maine each summer for dialogue and summer camp across conflict lines. In these dialogue huts, hard conversations happen, and there's special attention to set up intentional space to make it easier for people to be real with each other. My favorite ground rule, and one that I use when I facilitate hard conversations across lines of difference, is one that they use. It's called permission to be raggedy. When someone asks for permission to be raggedy, it means there's something they want to say, something that they may not be able to articulate as eloquently as they'd prefer, but they're asking the group to help them. If it comes out wrong or if it feels hurtful, the others in the group are asked to hold that space, to point out the place of injury, to extend generosity that the statement was not made from a place of ill will or intentional malice. So part of giving us space to build conflict resilience involves creating containers where we can have permission to be raggedy with each other. If there is the sense that the costs of putting your views out there are just too high, that if you say something wrong way, your reputation will be besmirched, that you'll end up being outed as a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, a socialist, an Antifa, fill in the blank, you will just say nothing. You know, one of the things I so admire about the work that Lucas, Eddie, Hassan, and his colleagues do at the Civil Conversations and On Being Project is the careful and thoughtful way that they curate conversations and the norms of engagement that invite participants to participate with authenticity and with courage, but also with safeguards to ensure equitable voice and to reduce replication of injury, intended or otherwise. And we even see this evening with features like chat chaplains that provide processing and space for holding. So lest my message about conflict resilience be misheard, I want to make this really clear. My argument is not that all of us at all times must choose dialogue and encounter. There are times when the wound may be too raw and the risk too high, when we are too tired, too angry, too exhausted. And there are times when we need to heal on our own, or to grieve, or to advocate. So my premise is not conflict resilience is a one-size-fits-all antidote to our current problems, but it is that conflict resilience is an important and necessary tool in the leader's toolbox, and one that is often not receiving its due, particularly in this moment. And so my encouragement is to challenge ourselves in the moment that we want to fight, or in the moment that we want to run away. I really reject the argument that sitting in a room with the other side is a path of accommodation or weakness. You know, I think it's fair to say that some of my conflict resilience heroes are the young Israeli and Palestinian teenagers that I've gotten to meet through my work with Seeds of Peace through the years. I mean, these are truly incredible, like off the chart young people. A few weeks ago, my friend Matt Devine, who is a former colleague at Seeds of Peace, delivered an extraordinary talk at Stanford Business School entitled "What's Possible When We Stay?" What's possible when we stay? I want to share, if my computer allows me, I want to share just a brief clip of what he learned from these Seeds of Peace campers when he was at the camp in Maine during the summer of 2014.
At the height of the 2014 war in Gaza, I worked as a summer counselor at a camp dedicated to conflict resolution between Palestinians and Israelis. Camp was founded on this extraordinarily simple idea that maintaining friendships across difference could make all the difference. Teens ate, slept, played sports together, chairs were thrown, yelling was frequent, but never did tears run more freely than when camp ended. Hugs between sides literally lasted minutes. Over the years, camp alumni communication channels, once so effusive and friendly, grew volatile with time and then silent. But under the surface were incredible stories of lives changed, even saved, because friends made the decision to show up for each other. In May of 2019, when violence spiked again in Gaza, a Palestinian man placed a call to a commander in the Israeli Defense Forces with a single request: please protect my family. His former campmate replied, "Of course, my friend, they will be safe." What makes these moments so impactful is not just the decision to pick up the phone, to reach out. It's also on the other side about how we choose to answer the call.
In my mind, the work of creating resiliency for discomfort, the tenacious ability to listen even as you want to scream, and the persistence to share your view with grace and with fullness. This should be important parts of our work in this moment, for the good of ourselves, our families, our organizations, our society. How will we choose to answer the call? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for those words. So tonight we've invited two people to respond and to reflect, to offer their reflections on what they've just heard. Dr. Ijoma Elesu is a senior internal medicine resident at the Massachusetts General Hospital with plans to specialize in cardiology. Dr. Elesu serves on the board of trainees in the Center of Diversity and Inclusion and is avidly involved in efforts to increase representation and diversity in the physician workforce. Dr. Elizu, please do correct my pronunciation if I've butchered that. I'm so sorry. And the same is true for Dr. Doreen DeFaria Ye, is the director of MGH Cardiology Fellowship Training Program and the faculty member in our Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Her clinical focus includes adult congenital heart disease and cardio obstetrics. So Dr. Ijoma Elizu, I think we'll hear from you first, and thank you so much for joining us and for offering your response.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I'm just so pleased to be here and inspired by this talk, especially in light of this year and everything that we have been through and seen. And so I just want to start off by saying that, you know, this conversation is wholly important in many different spaces. But of course, me being a physician and a physician in training, I find it very important from the space that I'm coming to you from. One thing that truly resonated with me was the quote, "You cannot remove the human from the action." And I think it's so interesting because we usually hear it the other way around. Can't remove, you know, the action from the human, but in this scenario, you know, I think it feels important to note that there is humanity in everything, and that we are more than our worst moments. We are more than the worst things that we may say, or even views that may not be wholly agreed with by the general public. I say this because I'm just thinking about the things that happened this year, in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was really fueled after the death of George Floyd. And I remember just being on the wards and that day just hoping that someone would just say something about it, acknowledge it. And that's not to say that I needed someone to come up with a solution, or even that I wanted in the coming moments for people to ask me what the solution would be, but just to acknowledge it. And so I think it's so important, this idea of conflict resilience, that we can just sit with each other and acknowledge the ugly things in our world. Another thing that really resonated with me was to reduce the replication of injury, I think you said, was a big part of conflict resilience, Bob. And so reducing the replication of injury to me means preventing the same things from happening over and over again, or history repeating itself. And so I thought that was, you know, truly excellent, because, you know, that's the point of any sort of conflict reducing measure that we take. You know, it's hard for me to separate myself from who you see today as a Black physician, a Black female physician. And I think that it's in some ways kind of maladaptive when we try to make things politically correct, in that you don't necessarily want to say that this is a Black female physician. You want to say other things, but this is so embedded in who I am and what I bring to the table. And so I think that just reorienting ourselves to truly just say what's in the room. And if the person feels differently, then the ability to have that conversation, so that you do reduce the replication of injury, and that you're not, you know, hurting people or hurting large groups of people, I should say. Lastly, I just say, you know, from the position of a physician, I think that we do this a lot, actually, without realizing. We walk into rooms and we take care of people with different views than us. And this may not be, you know, so general as somebody walking in with a political saying on their chest, which has happened to me on, wearing a shirt that has their political views that I don't necessarily agree with. But you walk into the room and you're expected to be your best self. And I think that we need to maybe expect a little bit of that self outside of the workroom, outside of the clinic, outside of the patient's room, and maybe bring a little bit of that self into other spaces. So those were my thoughts. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so, Dr. De Faria-Ye.
Great. Well, first off, I'd just like to extend my most sincere thanks for participating in this conversation in this way. It's wonderful to honor Bob Leffert, and I wish I knew him seeing those beautiful photos, but also to have the opportunity to reflect on what feels like probably one of the most important conversations that we all have as physicians this year, which is not about what we know as doctors and what we take as truth in science, but it's how we behave and present ourselves, how we extend ourselves as human beings to our patients, but also to each other. You comment, Bob, about grace and about patience, and I think sometimes it's easy to be authentic and not be graceful about it, and sometimes to be authentic at a time when maybe you're really hurt inside or when things feel raw, and be graceful at the same time sometimes feels like an impossible ask. And I appreciate that you commented that maybe there are some times when opening a conversation is not the right time because things really are raw. But I think ultimately we all have to realize that the listening that we do is probably the most important part of conversations that we have with each other. Being uncomfortable is really hard. And I think when we think about our community as caregivers and our community as educators, we have to think about how we pass along the opportunities we've had to get better at being better humans with one another. And as I think and I reflect on some of what Bob has talked about today, I think about all of the reasons why it can be hard to do. And I'm sure many of you out in the audience have been thinking about this too. Maybe I'll get just really angry and having a conversation where I know I may be at odds with the other, or maybe it takes time to do this. And in our busy lives, where do we find that time? And maybe I really want a resolution. And if that's not necessarily the ultimate goal, could this be a waste of time for both of us? But I think what you've done is really show us that there are tremendous benefits in just taking the time to listen, and that opportunity for us to gain empathy and become more empathetic in how we interact with each other. I think Ijeoma said so much that was really meaningful as well. And I just want to thank her for her comments. And I look forward to hearing others' thoughts on the line, because I'm sure many of you have many, many thoughts racing through your minds as I am right now, but I appreciate the opportunity to open the conversation.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, I just want to thanks to both of you for those reflections, which I know are from we share. And, there's so many, one of the great things about doing an event like this is the opportunity to learn. And as I was hearing both of you speak, I was thinking about the challenge, staying in a stance of conflict resilience, right, would be hard to do if we were focusing all of our attention on it. But hearing both of you, right, the challenge of working under extremely intense professional demands in a clinical setting, and thinking about how could we do this where there is very little time, where we're experiencing our own set of emotions while we're trying to be professional, and navigating that line of like, can I even let myself be in touch with my feelings and views here? And is it then okay and to raise them in some way? Do I even have the time? Is this opening up a Pandora's box? I think are all really hard questions. And as someone whose professional energies are around this, or at least a portion of them are around this work, I'm always aiming for the sustained dialogue over a long period of time, with the proper conditions, set. But I think there's this real question of how do we do this in the day to day? What does it look like? What are the challenges and what are the barriers? And this is more of a negotiation thing than a conflict resilience thing. But I query also, what are the alternatives? Because that's something I've been grappling with a lot, right? What are the alternatives to kind of listening? What are the alternatives to authentic sharing of our narrative, our story? So I just put some questions out there that also may, kind of in response to your reflections, and also may spark others as we move into a bigger conversation. And also, again, with profound thanks for being willing to share on incredibly short notice. So thanks.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ijoma and Doreen. I think about one of the fact that one of the things that we often that our guests on our shows often, some of the wisdom that's often offered is that we have to change our orientation to the idea that we can treat anyone as dispensable or disposable, or that or that it's possible to live our lives truly separate from one another. The truth is, our lives are interdependent whether we like it or not. And I think that's a part of what infectious disease, part of what the pandemic has shown us, right? And so we've got to figure out how to exist together in some way in all the stages of our relationships. We always exist in relationship to each other. It's just the quality of that relationship that's at question. And I think that's a lot of it sounds to me that that's a lot of what you're lifting up, Bob. I'd like for us to go into a 5-minute break at this point, just to give folks an opportunity to take care of any needs that they may have, and just to have a small moment, and then we're going to come back for a fuller conversation. And so we're just going to stop for 5 minutes, and thank you all for being here so far, and we hope to have you back 5 minutes from now. Thank you. Okay, everyone, welcome back. So I'd like to invite, I'd like to open us up and invite us to be in conversation with each other. As we do that, I want to make a few additional housekeeping notes. One is I recognize that people have different comfort levels with engaging, and so